Hey guys, welcome back for more tutorials. My name is Magnet, and today we're going to be talking about using Mech against Zerg. This is something we haven't really gotten very far into is all the Mech tutorials, considering it's a little harder to find replays for that. But it is becoming more and more of a thing, and I know Blizzard's trying to push it a lot harder in the future, so we will start talking about that. Mostly in TvZ, this is all about refining your composition as far as what type of units you have out. If you have a lot of like Hellions or something, that's going to be really bad against things like Swarm Hosts, so you need to know what your opponent's doing and kind of react properly to that. Mostly you need to know to stay patient with Mech and attack when you know that it's really time to attack. And also you definitely need to know how to keep your army alive, because if you keep losing Mech armies, that's a good way to lose the game, considering the units are so big and so expensive. Zerg really wants to keep that count low. So let's go ahead and jump into this game here so you guys can start watching. This is going to be Byong versus True, both extremely good players in Korea, and Byong is really starting to become one of the more pioneerish type of players for Mech, especially against Protoss, which I'm hoping to get some replays for that, but Byong didn't start doing a lot of Mech against Protoss until a lot later, until after these replays were done. And also it was in Pro League, and I don't have those replays, so that's unfortunate, but still, I mean, we've talked so much about the openers in this matchup that we're not going to focus too much on that. Mostly going to talk about the ways that they start getting into Mech. And I will say before we even get too far, the 3 Hellion at a time Blue Flame type of openers that we've seen, talked about a little bit in the harassment videos, that's one of the best ways to get into Mech, considering you will be making a lot of Hellions anyway, and you'll usually be spending your gas on things like upgrades and maybe some tanks to start mixing in there. So that's a really good way to get into it, and I'm not sure if we're going to see that in these games, but it's super common. This time Byong's just going to open up with a Cloak Banshee, and this is all really normal stuff. Again, we've already talked about this, so not any reason to really repeat our words. Taking a pretty quick third base here, and this is what Mech is really all about. You need these extra geysers to start getting your Mech army big enough to start mattering. And True realizes that, and he kind of realizes that third bases with this type of harassment going on is very common, so he might try to counterattack. So you definitely need to be aware of stuff like that. Maybe keep some Hellions back at home to hold stuff like that off. But getting this third base secured as soon as possible is really an important factor. And honestly, since holding your third is so important with Mech, I would not be opposed at all to making this a planetary. Obviously it is a little bit more expensive and it hurts your economy by just a tad. But if it's for safety and if you're feeling more confident with the planetary behind you, then it's totally fine to go ahead and go that route instead. So Zerglings are coming in here trying to deal some damage. As long as he repairs and maybe walls off, brings his Hellions back, he should be just fine. Wouldn't expect too much to come of this, so it shouldn't be that much of a concern. Of course, the Hellions being on the map is really important, so you can come back and deal with that. So not a whole lot going on here. Here's the double armory. This is about when you want to add it, is when you're starting to add on extra, or when you're thinking about adding on extra factories. The double armor before extra factories is actually pretty greedy, so you need to be a little bit careful about that. Mostly because you're going to obviously be spending money on these armories and the upgrades before you're even going to see units that can benefit that. So it might even be a lot safer just to add on a second factory, maybe start producing some tanks or something before you throw down this double armory. This is super, super greedy from Byong. He's going to be relying on his Banshees a lot to deal with a lot of the counterattacks that are going to be coming up. Notice that he's not being very aggressive about killing drones with that because he knows these need to be more of a defensive unit. So I'd be just a little bit careful, but once the third base gets mining is when you can start adding on your extra factories. You can start adding on armories and whatnot for your upgrades. You definitely do want to do double upgrades with Mech because they're just going to be so much more important to take damage as well as deal the damage to lift us off. And again, if he had a planetary here, this is what I want to address. If he had a planetary here, he'd still be mining from this, because the planetary can shut down these annoying Zergling counterattacks all day long. Here comes the extra factories. You can see the engineering bay 4 turrets. You do need to know that Mutalisk timings are about at this time, maybe 11 minutes or so is when you're going to see one of the faster Muta builds come out. It's usually 2 base Muta. But you definitely do need to be aware of that, and you need to be at least having tools to deal with that. Most of the time from Zerg, let's talk about from their perspective for a second. From Zerg, they usually want to switch between big Roach armies and big Muta armies, and mainly because in order to counter Mutalisks, you really need Thors, and in order to counter Roaches, you really need tanks. And if you're forcing the Terran to constantly switch back and forth between those two and maybe get caught with the wrong unit composition, those are times that you can usually win. So you need to be aware of what they're doing here. You need to be aware of what buildings they have, using scans. You can also be using your Hellions and stuff to run in there and see what kills them. If If you see a lot of roaches, you need to obviously start tanks. If you see a lot of mutalisks, you obviously need to start Thors. And the engineering bay is there basically to help out and help buffer against these mutalisks a little bit. So you can drop a turret here, maybe a turret to protect your production a little bit. Turret in each base isn't a bad idea, so you need to be aware of what can come and not lose too much, especially economically against mutalisk type of plays. You need to know what units you need to produce against what they're doing. So if we had perfect vision in this game, we would see mutalisks are on the way, I need to start Thors. And Byung might figure that, maybe seeing the no roach warren has come up. We'll have to see what comes off of these tech labs, but it's really going to dictate what tech lab production you spice up, or rather spice up. What? I don't know where that word came from, but what units you'll want to support your Hellions with, considering it's what you're going to be dumping your minerals into. So he realizes what's going on, he starts Thors. Shouldn't take any damage from these mutas, really. Another concern can also be swarm hosts, and that's mostly what you're going to see to try to counter Mech, considering they can just put out units endlessly and kind of trade quote-unquote freely. But you can see the turret is already done here. Some Vikings are also really good to help out against these mutalisk plays, and honestly I would not be opposed to always have at least a few Vikings in your army at all times. Mainly because they can do well to zone out the mutalisks a little bit. You can sit them over turrets or something and force them to engage into it if they really want to fight the Vikings. They help out a lot against longer term mutalisk plays, but especially against swarm hosts, if you have those in Ravens, there's a lot of points where you can catch the swarm hosts being abandoned, like they won't have locusts there or something, and you can maybe land the Vikings and drop seeker missiles and stuff on top of the swarm host. So Vikings definitely do have a lot of utility against Mech. Speaking of that, here's the swarm host transition on the way. Note that there's 2-2 on the way from these armories, as well as Blue Flame, all upgrades that you definitely want to get with Mech. And note that he's still customizing his production according to what he's seen out of the Zerg. Right now he doesn't have anything spinning on his factories. He might be waiting to see what's going on with the Zerg because he definitely does have the money. So if he were to see an infestation pit, we'd have to think through this and think, well, swarm hosts usually don't, infestors usually don't do a lot against this. He hasn't started a hive, so this has got to be for swarm hosts. And if that's the case, I definitely need tanks. I could maybe even start thinking about getting my Raven production started, considering later games with Ravens are going to be very important to start eating up those locust shots with PDDs and whatnot. He doesn't quite understand what's going on yet, so he's starting more Thors, and he's also starting more planetaries and turrets, as well as sensor towers, just to get position and kind of turtle up a little bit. We've already talked more about being aggressive with your Mech, and this is more so about just regular Mech. Regular kind of just sitting back, waiting until you have the huge death army and killing them with that. And part of that is really finding ways to not die. So this could be for an extra planetary. This could also be for a 4th base. But you don't really want to start venturing out into 4th base territory until you know for sure that you're safe against that. And the extra planetary is just a buffer against attacks like roaches or locusts in this case is going to be really valuable. He's also landed his barracks just to try to mess up some pathing and kind of give himself some protection against some attacks. So note that the army does look pretty sparse right now, but it's only looked sparse because he opened up with mutalisks. Getting building armor is also really good to help out against things like locusts trying to hit your planetaries and whatnot in the later games. So all these upgrades are really important and just something to keep mind on. Here's an extra command center. Maybe this is going to be for the planetary, and maybe this is going to be for the 4th base, but note that you will always have a lot of minerals floating around here, and the extra minerals can be spent on things like Helibats or Hellions if you want, but a lot of times it is okay to go ahead and just use those extra minerals to drop a bunch of extra command centers, whether that's to dump SCVs and get more mules out and get your army supply larger, or just to use them for planetaries and defensive structures and whatnot. So now that he knows the swarm hosts are on the way, he's going to be all tanks all the time here. And this can suck, honestly. This can suck to have to wait for this long until you can fend off these swarm hosts for long enough. But this is exactly what's going to happen to Byung. So we're going to see this for quite a while, and we're going to see him continue to rally swarm hosts forward. And Byung's just going to have to absorb that until he's ready to go. So if you're stuck in this kind of position, which can happen a lot, you basically just need to not lose any units to this. You can repair your hurt units, of course, if that comes up. But mainly you just want to wait until you can get a big enough army to just attack them and hope that they can not hold it off. So that's a lot of the components to Mech, especially if you decide to play passively. This is also why I suggest things like Ravens and the extra Vikings, because if he sends all of his locusts forward and he doesn't have support for his swarm hosts, which is exactly what we see here, you can just land your Vikings on top of it and kind of punish him for not really having the right support. So if they're this invested into swarm hosts, they're not really going to have a lot sitting over it to help out. And that's why I really recommend the Vikings here. Maybe you can land on top of it and scan and eliminate some swarm hosts that way, but this really is just going to come down to Byong just sitting around until it's time to go, and that can be a long time. So it's a pretty long game. We're just going to have to wait, and this is what you're going to see a lot with Mech anyway. So I mostly don't want to hear the explosion sounds of the tanks, but we know that the attack is going on for most of the time. So let's take a look at everything else that's going on. He's still adding on Vikings. He's spending his minerals on Hellions, which you can use just to walk around and kind of run by a little bit. He sees that there's really no support here, so maybe he can think about landing his Vikings, but either way, he should be fine for a little while. Hive is on the way as well, so you need to be on top of what's going on there. And the extra planetaries are coming up now. You can see there's a planetary here at the 4th base, and these other 2 command centers really were just for orbitals, so he is using that for extra meals. Let's take a look at his income right now. He's only on 60 workers, and I know we talk a lot about macro. You want to be on about 70, but this is the phase of the game where you can start feeling free to dump SCVs, just because the bigger the mech army, the scarier. If you throw away maybe 6 or 7 SCVs, that could be a couple of extra tanks. And of course you're okay to do that, because if you have all these extra command centers that can drop mules, you can replace those SCVs mining pretty easily. So that's kind of the idea in the later stage of the game with mech. Conversely, you can also get into a super later stage of the game where you start adding a lot of Ravens and a lot of battle cruisers. That usually won't come up until after you make your first big push. And you can see, look at Byong's army, it's getting enormous, and he's just waiting until the right time to go. When that time is to go, True is going to be in a lot of trouble because he just doesn't have the proper support of these swarm hosts. So if he starts losing swarm hosts and doesn't really have an answer, he's in pretty bad shape. So here we go. Byong is finally deciding, okay, I'm maxed out. Can't get any bigger of an army. It's time to go. It's time to start trading against these. And note that he's also pulling SCVs here, because if you lose these SCVs, it doesn't really matter, but it is handy to have them just to repair. So what you can do, you'll notice that Byong has done this. You can select all the SCVs to go with you, right-click on repair, and just assign them to a unit in your mech army, and they'll continue to follow the army and repair as you go along. So Byong definitely needs to bring the rest of his army here, but these swarm hosts don't get lifted up. This is the point where the tanks could just siege right on top of him. The Vikings could land. He could deal a ton of damage to the swarm host. And now this is the point where you're in control. You're kind of the person that's attacking, and it's up to the Zerg to try and stop this. So if they're trying to stop this with Mutalisks to support, you already have a ton of Thors. You already have your Vikings out. You can send your Vikings back to deal with stuff like this if you absolutely need to. That's exactly what we're seeing here. So it's really just pushing your opponent around at this point, and getting to a point where you can get inside their base and start hitting their base, and they don't really have much of an answer for it. So that's kind of what we're seeing here, and Byong is going to start getting super aggressive once he gets all this army put together. And this should be pretty interesting. He's also keeping some tanks behind, just to defend against some locusts that might stay behind, and kind of punishing him for not being here to protect his bases. So he's going to continue to move forward with his mech army. He's going to leave some tanks behind against these locusts. You might lose a base here. You can't always just lift off if you need to. This is really intelligent, trying to funnel the locusts all to one place by landing your barracks there, so really good play there on Byong. Notice the extra command centers coming down in masses right now, so he can drop extra mules and replace what he might have lost as far as SCVs during the fight. And also just so he has a bigger army later in the game. So you can see some Hellions over here doing some damage. You can't split him up if he isn't really reacting well. And there's just, I don't understand how he's supposed to stop this army if it gets good positioning, because there's so many tanks here that can deal well with the Locust. You'll notice that the mech upgrades are really good, 3-3. There are enough Thors here to deal with any Mutalisks attacks that might come along. The Vikings should also be somewhere along the map. Here we go. And again, there's always the opportunity to land these Vikings on top of the swarm host if you can find the right time. So that's something to look out for, but pro players typically don't get caught very often with that. The Vikings are still dealing a lot of damage to these Mutalisks, and that's why it's really useful to build that count up throughout the game in case they try to counterattack. But you can see this mech army is just absolutely menacing, and this is really just a product of him waiting long enough and finding the right time, and the right time is just when he was maxed out, to just push in there and be like, okay, and now it's your turn to try and stop me. And a lot of times you're going to win this way by just pushing in there as hard as you can and not really giving them a good opportunity to slow this down. So eventually, he's just going to knock down so much mining that he can make whatever he wants against the swarm host and win. There's only a few more minutes, and True gets a little bit desperate. Byong can just siege right on top of it, and that's basically how this game ends. So there's not a whole lot more to see in this one. Let's go ahead and jump into the next one where we can see a little bit of a different stuff coming down. This next one especially was something I really liked, so this should be a really fun game to watch. Whoops, I'm typing into Photoshop. So, we'll just be watching Jockji versus going up against Happy Zerg. And this is from the Challenger League of Europe, so Jockji definitely is a better player here, but Happy Zerg's still no slouch. And we're going to see Jockji run a beautiful mech build that's something that I really, really like, kind of showcasing a little bit more of the late game mech potential. So again, we're going to have to fast forward for a little while until we get to the right spot in this game. So we're going to watch this kind of develop at high speeds, times 8ing it, something that's pretty common when you're watching replays. He's opening Command Center first, by the way, which is okay if you know how to run the transitions. A little bit greedy, but as long as you're comfortable with doing that, it's definitely viable. So, getting the factory now. This is going to be for Hellions once again, which we talked about before a lot of times. 99% of pro games will open up with Hellions in some form or another, so that's not very uncommon. He's also going to be going Banshee like in the last game. So I know I mentioned the whole Blue Flame opener. That's a good springboard for Mech. You can see that in the harassment builds, or rather the harassment openers video. It'll talk a little bit how to do that, but basically you just get a lot of Blue Flame Hellions out and you try to kill some drones with it, and it transitions fine, but the Banshee transition's also fine as well. So he's adding on his third command center, like we talked about. Getting the third base is really important for Mech. You can't really mech off of 2. He's also being greedy once again, so this is basically the same build as last game. Being greedy, getting these armories before the extra factories. This is, again, something I wouldn't advise unless you're really comfortable with Mech. I would really advise getting the faster factories before man, why am I totally spacing out here? Before the armories. So the Hellion count is pretty huge here, by the way. So this is a little bit different from last game. He's being a lot more aggressive with his Hellions. And if you can ever build this Hellion count up, you can get a lot of drone kills. You just really need to be careful of when the Mutalisks come out, which is why knowing the timings is important. Last game we said about 11 minutes is really fast for Mutalisks. This is even faster. This is going to come out about 10:30. So you need to know at about maybe 10 minutes is when you need to start thinking about cooling off here. You'll notice he's adding on a Thor because he knows that the Mutalisk transition is underway. He should have seen the Spire in some form or another. So spending scans just to know what's going on is really important. And he's moving his command center down. This again is an orbital and it's not a planetary at the third. He just wants the extra mules. He's okay with being a little bit greedy, but once again, you will have to deal with annoying stuff like this every once in a while. You have to bring your Hellions home. Although conversely, by this point, the Mutalisks might be on the map anyway, so it wouldn't be that bad of an idea to start getting your Mutalisks, or rather getting your Hellions back home. And here's what I'm talking about from the Zerg. This is opening mutas and switching into roaches, just to trying to catch them off guard with the wrong unit compositions. You definitely do need to know what's coming down. You definitely do need to react to that. So roach speed on the way as well. It's a pretty big commitment into roaches. We know it's not going to be some fake or anything like that. So you definitely do need to know it. You definitely do need to customize your tech lab production based upon what type of units they're making. This is also going to be for something like Swarm Host as well. So here's the infestation pit. The roaches really haven't done much yet, but he does have the speed for it. Here they finally start coming out, so he'll have to realize what's going on here and start producing that. But we can also say that once you have like enough turrets up, maybe 5 Thors or so, Mutalisks aren't really that big of a concern, so you can just start adding on tanks anyway, and if they continue to produce Mutalisks, then you can add on more Thors. So you can blindly just start out with a few Thors if they've opened up Mutalisks, and stay on Thors for a little while, and then just automatically switch into tanks, because you should be expecting things like roaches and swarm hosts and stuff to be on the way soon enough anyway. Of course, there are opportunities for run-bys and whatnot for the Hellions, and losing these really isn't that devastating, so don't worry too much about that. It's fine just to get drone kills with it. We'll notice that Jockji is also supporting a lot more with Hellbats, whereas previously Beyond was supporting with Hellions. I really do prefer the Hellbats, but fortunately for you, you can choose between the two of them, considering the upgrade to change between the two of them is free as far as these newer patches. Here's some Vipers on the way, here's some Broodlords on the way, so there's all kinds of new stuff we're seeing in this game. The Vipers especially are going to be something that's new, and something that can be really annoying, and that's another reason why it's smart to build up your Viking count throughout the game, because you can maybe snipe some of these Vipers and get them off the field before they use their poles or before they use their blinding clouds on your army. So there's not really a great solution to dealing with these Vipers outside of the Vikings. It's really just making sure that your army is spread out enough and that you have enough surface area so that the blinding clouds don't blind your entire army at the same time. That's a really good way you can lose with Mech. Here's the Ultralis Cavern on the way as well, so Zerg just opening up every single option here. And we're going to show that Mech is going to be fine against pretty much every option if you know what to do. So know how Jokshi's spreading out his tanks here, and just kind of spreading them out so that the blinding clouds really can't hit two at once. That's the whole idea behind spreading them out like this. If you have them all in one big clump, it's really easy to land blinding clouds. And here's that timing once again. Jokshi has realized that he's max and he's just going to go. And he's going to make Zerg have to react to him. But note that behind this, he's taking his 4th base, or at least he will be taking it once the creep proceeds. He's also adding on extra starports. So there's one. Where's the other ones? Well, they're around here somewhere. I just can't see them. I don't know where they are, but they are definitely in productions. We can see them on the tab. But he's adding on extra starports so that he can start switching into more late game stuff. Here they are. Which is going to be things like Ravens, things like battle cruisers, and if you get enough of that stuff, especially enough Ravens, there's really almost nothing a Zerg can do by that stage of the game. So Mech leading into really super late game Terran with a lot of battle cruisers, Ravens, and stuff like that can be really, really strong. Here's the blinding clouds now, but we'll note that he only got 3 off, and they're not really doing a whole lot. He's not even really sieging his tanks here. But he also doesn't really mind taking an equal trade because it's really all about the later stages of the game for him. So now that he's basically traded against the Zerg army, he might have to go home considering the reinforcements will just run him over pretty easily. He's still rallying forward here, and notes that the Zerg is going to be starting to show Ultralisks, which we haven't really talked about yet. Ultralisks can be countered okay by most of the units you'll produce anyway. The biggest key is kind of keeping your tanks in the regular mode against Ultralisk, because the siege won't really do damage faster than the regular shots here. So you can see they do 31 damage against armored. The Thors do quite a bit of damage against that as well. So either Thors or tanks will be fine, but you also do want to remember to splash in some Hellbats and stuff to protect against big Zergling attacks, because if you don't have your siege tanks in siege mode, you will need something to buffer against those lings. So Ultralisks are not a huge deal as far as against Mech. They can be really strong, but most of the time you want to be having your tanks in the regular mode. You will want to have a good number of Thors, and as long as you have that, you can kind of select your army, maybe select the tanks independently and focus down the Thors. Here's what I'm talking about with those Zerglings. They can be really irritating against non-siege tanks. The blinding cloud coming down here, but mostly it's really about getting into the later stages of the game. He's adding on Vikings now, going to start adding on Ravens here in the near future. He could start adding on battle cruisers and stuff as well. I'm not sure if the game actually goes this late, but also notice that throughout the game he was adding in Banshees as well. This is something that's really, really intelligent, because the Banshees are going to be a super long-term play against that. If you have enough protection against Mutalisks and whatnot, then these Banshees really won't ever die unless they specifically start to counter that. So the Banshees can be really useful in later stages of this game, and that's why adding on these extra starports is really useful as well. So you can just go for things like Banshees, but if they start to get infestors and they fungal it, then that can be kind of annoying. That's why battlecruisers are typically the more late game type of thing. But the Banshees and the Vikings can be a good gateway to getting into that later game army. So you can see he pushes that off okay, doesn't lose too much, just remorphs his command center, and he's in just fine shape. Here come the Broodlords now, and this is why getting the Vikings out as well is really important, and the later game transition into a lot of starport stuff is really good as well. So these Broodlords really won't matter too much, and you can see that by the way you're producing and by the way you're transitioning off of Mech, you're kind of just nullifying all of Zerg's options. He can't really go Ultralist because there's too many Banshees out there, it'll kill it too easily. He can't really go Broodlords because there's too many Vikings. He can't really go Infestors because there's too many tanks. This is the type of thing that you get into with Mech in the late game. It's just kind of nullifying every Zerg option. So if you can last this long, if you're not taking terrible trades, you're kind of keeping the Zerg under control with maybe some Hellion run-bys and stuff, you should be in just fine shape. And here come the Ravens now. So he should be in really good shape from this point forward. And I kind of want to show the way this game ends because it's pretty hilarious. I think you guys will like it a lot. So extra starports on the way still. Here comes the big swaths of command centers. 5 command centers on the way because he really can't spend his money on anything that makes that much sense. So just getting the extra mules and whatnot and dumping some SCVs can definitely be an option. We'll note that he's on 72 right now, so you could easily dump down to about 50 SCVs and get a huge army if you wanted to. So that's always an option. But Raven's still coming out here, and again, he's still just waiting until he maxes out. But the high Banshee, Raven, and Viking count is going to be the mainstay of what his army is. The tanks are going to matter less and less as the game goes on, so I wouldn't worry too much more about that, unless they're sieging with Stormhost or something. So the Zerg army is getting pretty big here, a lot of Broodlords, a lot of Corruptors. Notice that Jockey's spending a lot of scans here, and that can be another side effect of all these extra command centers, is dropping scans to know what's going on and where the army is. So he's all good as far as that front. This game's going to end here pretty soon, but I really wanted to get to this point, so I apologize for this if this video is running a little bit long, but I promise the ending is totally worth it. Note that the Raven count is getting huge, and this is one of the biggest things that Zerg complain about, is that there's really not a good answer for Ravens right now. And honestly, I kind of have to agree. Dealing with that huge of a Raven count is hard as hard things. That analogy. So it's very hard to deal with that Zerg, and notice these Banshees still have utility, focusing down bases and whatnot. Jeez, I'm like tripping over myself all over the place here. There's a building armor upgrade, so there's really normal stuff here. Let's just fast forward until the engagement comes up, because I want to show you the usefulness of these Ravens once this happens. And we'll be there very soon. We're almost there. Note, I also want to point out really fast, and I won't pause this considering we've already paused too much. Note the final structure layout of Jokshi's base here. He has extra command centers everywhere. He has turrets and sensor towers everywhere. He has a ton of starports, a lot of factories. He can make whatever he wants. Turrets here as well. Look at the mini-map as well, noting that there's all of these vision rings around the map from these sensor towers. So he knows if the Zerg ever enters his side of the map, he's going to know all about it. He's going to know exactly where it's from. Even getting the super late game upgrades like high-sec auto-tracking is going to add extra range to his planetaries and even his turrets that he drops out of his Ravens, so that should be pretty cool. Also, the building armor will benefit the Ravens and the turrets, considering they do benefit from that. So we're going to start to see this come to a head here, and Jokji is maxed out on the unit composition that he really wants, which is a lot of Ravens, a lot of Vikings. You can see his Viking count is huge. The tanks really won't go into siege mode unless they absolutely have to. But here we go. Where's the Zerg army right now? You can see it's a ton of Broodlords, a couple of Ultralists here and there, a lot of Corruptors. You can even see just from this composition that there's not a whole lot the Zerg can do, because considering the Vikings could almost win this fight single-handedly. But the Ravens are the most important part here, considering you can drop PDDs against the Corruptors, you can use Seeker missiles and whatnot, and we're going to see this game end here in just a second. It's going to be fun. Some scans coming down here just to deny creep, trying to see where the army is. Here come the Ravens and stuff forward now. He's starting to drop a lot of point defense drones and starting to drop the Seeker missiles here. So just drop the point defense drones just to protect your Vikings against the Corruptors. And the Seeker missiles, if you put them down in his army and he doesn't react fast enough, they'll blow up pretty much everything. So that's what we're going to see here. There's a lot of stuff's going to happen, but yeah, there goes his army. And it's killed off like 60 supply instantly from those Ravens. So you can see, once you get to this stage of the game, your army is pretty much invincible. Unless the Zerg reacts perfectly, or unless they dealt some damage to you earlier in the game. So Mech is enormously strong in the late game, and that's what I really wanted to show off in this replay. From this point, Jokji just kind of marches down his throat, and there's nothing that Happy Zerg can do to stop it. So pretty cool end of the game there, and I guess we'll just call this good. So I hope you guys enjoyed that video. I'll be back very soon with more, so look out for that, and I'll see you guys later.